in the Faculty of Global Liberal Studies at the New York University. Her research is grounded in the study of Bangladesh, development studies, transnational feminist theory, anthropology of Islam, and human rights. She has published extensively on supply chain capitalism, and the global garment industry, as well as on gender justice, Muslim women, and cultural politics of nationalism. Professor Siddiqi serves on the advisory board of the renowned journal Dialectical Anthropology and is one of the editorial board members of Routledge's Women in Asia publication series. She is a member of the executive committee of American Institute of Bangladesh Studies, is on the advisory committees of Sadia Wahid Gender Initiative, Lahore University of Management Sciences, and also on the South Asian Feminist Network, Sangat. Professor Siddiqui has frequently collaborated with a number of Bangladeshi human rights organizations, including Ain o Shalish Kendro, Nagorik Udyog, and the Bangladesh Legal and Services Trust. Given that this year Bangladesh is celebrating 50 years of its emergence as an independent nation state, the title of our presentation acquires particular relevance. We look forward with eager anticipation to hearing the perspectives she will bring to bear on our understanding of this landmark event. Without further ado, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Midurai, Professor Salim, and Professor Gupta and all the students for organizing this. I'm delighted to be here. I don't usually get to address audiences in India so easily, so I'm especially grateful for the invitation. And as the introduction rightly pointed out, it's 50 years of Bangladesh's independence, then that does add a particular layer of meaning to my presentation. So I want, in that light, I have a couple of caveats before I begin. One is, of course, I don't think I've ever been invited to speak at a history department before. So that is, interesting. I'm very pleased about that. Very looking forward to the feedback. But also, second, Bangladesh in the global or in the Euro-American imaginary has acquired over the last 50 years a very distinctive or occupies a distinctive space in the Euro-American imagination. And it's either the happy face of capitalism or an aid lab, with women garment workers or microcredit, or it's seen as the site of the hyper exploitation of female labor through the global supply chain, or more recently, it's become the touchstone or an index of an unfolding global climate disaster. So Bangladesh plays a lot of anxieties and ideologies are projected onto this space that is imagined as Bangladesh. I think that's true in Euro-America. There's a different discourse from when it comes to India, and particularly in Bengal, it's much more specific. So either it's a place of hope where there's a Bengali, real Bengali culture is being practiced, or for many others, it's a place of danger. Always a source of infiltration, illegality. So the idea of Bangladesh is interesting to play with and think about. And as I was thinking about location and audience, what I want to say is very much in relation to what I think of the audience and location. So that's my first caveat. My second caveat is I don't necessarily just, my primary work for the last few years has been on women garment workers in the global supply chain. And it's through that I have constantly found myself thinking about global narratives of Islam as they are mediated through the bodies of Bangladeshi garment workers who are assumed to be Muslim. Of course, Bangladesh doesn't have just a Muslim population, but that too is a narrative that's reinscribed. Okay, I'm going to start. I hope, this will not sound too anecdotal in parts, but I am going to take vignettes and stories and work around them. So in this paper, I take Ekattur, a shorthand for the claims and valences of the story of the War of 1971, to be a narrative resource, one that is actively mobilized by various constituencies as particular points in Bangladesh's history and feminist politics. So the paper is definitely not about what happened and the contestations around that. I am interested in the legacy of 1971, in particular, both the belated and highly incomplete wartime trials for the atrocities, including mass rape, committed in 1971, as well as an increasing perception in popular nationalist and official discourse of the interchangeability between Islam, political Islam, and the Jamaat-e-Islami that begins in the 1980s and really comes to a head in the 1990s and is now naturalized and being unpacked again. For those who may not know, key members of East Pakistan's Jamaat-e-Islami actively collaborated with the Pakistani army. Only a few of these Razakars, as they were called, and if you know the history of Hyderabad, that might sound really ironic. Only a few Razakars have been tried and punished for war crimes. It is instructive, however, that the lines between collaborators or Razakars and political dissenters have become blurred over time. Partly, I suggest, because sanctioned secular narratives make it impossible to think Pakistan could ever have been an appealing idea to those who are also loyal to the Bangladeshi state. So, how stories of 1971 are told? Who gets to tell the story? What questions can be asked? And what becomes unspeakable over time? All critically shape intersections of gender, nation, and Islam in contemporary Bangladesh. In this paper, I draw on political anthropologist Irfan Ahmed's provocative suggestion that the 1947 partition was not a solution to, but an escape from the Muslim question in British India. I extend his analysis to suggest that Bangladeshi nationalist historiography's inability to come to terms with partition/Pakistan ensures the return of the Muslim question over and again. It is now evident that the end of the war in 1971 did not signal closure on the religion question, but glossed over key contradictions in the relationship between religion and political community. It is these irresolutions and displacements that haunt politics in the present. The unresolved nature of the Muslim question has serious implications for gender politics, and really my larger work, that is part of what my larger work is concerned with. Among other things, this enables more recent forms of religiously inflected violence to be understood exclusively and reductively through the lens of 1971. Dominant framings of so-called fatwa-related violence in the 1990s are a case in point, and I will come back to that and talk a little bit more, elaborate more on this. For now, I want to underline that reducing violence to the cultural or religious doesn't just misrecognize the multiple and intersecting source of disciplinary power that shapes women's lives. This resort to the cultural or religious, as Laila Abulugod and Mahmoud Mamdani note in different contexts, performs critical ideological work. One, it renders invisible or normalizes secular or state-sanctioned violence. Two, it draws attention away from the global disciplinary apparatus of capital in which the nation and national capital is deeply invested, right? So as a result, certain forms of violence are recognized as violence on the bodies of women. And that violence reinscribes those bodies as Muslim bodies in danger from Muslim men, if you will, while other kinds of violence are not. So for instance, garment workers not being paid for months on end is neither considered a woman's issue nor recognized as the structural violence that it is. Nor are the experiences of wives, sisters, mothers, and daughters dealing with disappearances or extrajudicial killings considered to be the subjects of violence. Finally, and critically, this sometimes obsession with Islam absolves or invisibilizes actual, what I would call Bengali male patriarchy. And it's only in the realm of cultural production, in novels like Shaheen Akhtar's Talash or films like Rubaiyat Hussein's Meherjan, have the complicities of what we might call non-religious patriarchies as they shape women's lives been underscored. So of course there is a relationship between the sexual violence of 1971 and the sexual violence that comes in today, but that line cannot be connected simply through the resort to religion or culture, as I argue. Okay, so I'm going to go to my first section, which is really looking at the hauntings of 47 in 1971. Bangladesh stands out in post-colonial South Asia for its strikingly anomalous relationship to what neighbors consider to be the foundational event in the region's modern history, the 1947 partition of British India. Official acknowledgement, celebratory or otherwise, is notable for its absence. Unofficial spaces are hardly more forthcoming. In the weeks leading up to the 50th anniversary of Indian and Pakistani independence, I was struck by the seeming irrelevance of a moment that in other national contexts appeared to be profoundly meaningful. The BBC and CNN International, cable channels available to audiences in Dhaka, devoted extensive coverage to related events. In contrast, Bangladeshi media outlets exhibited a muted interest or ignored the anniversary altogether. 2 decades later, things have changed, but somewhat. Significant silences persist and extend to the realm of scholarship and popular culture. Public recognition of 1947 in collective memory and institutional sites continues to be subdued at best. What accounts for this apparent indifference? Most obviously, the country's relationship to the 1947 partition is mediated by the events of 1971, so that arguably the significance of the latter overwhelms any attention to the former. By this logic, partition may well have lost relevance for contemporary Bangladeshi reality. I think this is an inadequate explanation. It does not shed light, for instance, on the curious neglect or outright erasure of partition or independence that marks nationalist narratives and historiography. Why is it that the 3-volume History of Bangladesh, published by the Asiatic Society in the 1990s and edited by Professor Sirajul Islam, does not name partition as such, or even have a chapter on it. For that matter, the stunning new Muktijodha Museum, with its deeply moving, exhaustively researched exhibits, devotes relatively little space to partition stories, referenced obliquely through the figures of Gandhi, Jinnah, and Mountbatten, and the Calcutta killings of 1946. Of course, events in 1975 irreversibly changed the set of associations with August 15th. It is probably not incidental that this was the date that Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was gunned down in a military coup. The symbolism of eliminating the official father of the nation, one who embodied the aspirations of the secular Bengali intelligentsia on that particular date, surely did not escape his killers, and may well have signified the smashing of a specific social order. We will never know for sure, but the irrevocable shift in meaning ensured that August 15th has a very distinctive place in the historiography and national narrative of Bangladesh. So when the Awami League returned to power after a period of military rule in 1996, then Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina declared the 15th to be a day of official mourning, a national holiday. In an extraordinary and some would say spiteful gesture, when the opposition party came to power, Khaleda Zia began to celebrate her official birthday on the same day. By decree, the meaning changed overnight. From a day of national mourning, it was reduced to a spectacle of coerced official celebrations marked by elaborate public rituals of cake cutting and congratulatory messages. This overt move to re-signify the meaning of August 15th was reversed after Sheikh Hasina's return to power. Clearly, August 15th inside Bangladesh occupies a distinctive field of signification, fundamentally unrelated to discourses of partition or independence elsewhere. There is more to the story, however. I suggest that 1947 does not merit remembrance, let alone celebration, because to address it directly would be to unsettle a carefully constructed teleology of Bengali secular nationhood. That is, the unconscious erasure of partition is an attempt to gloss over the incongruous, to banish memories, desires, and narratives that sit awkwardly with an ostensibly unifying secular story. In other words, it is the need for an active forgetting of certain fractious histories that renders the historiography of Bangladesh askew from the rest of the subcontinent. Within this normative secular framework, even with competing versions, 1947 cannot constitute independence, true independence. It denotes instead one moment in the continuing history of Muslim Bengal's colonial domination. Thus, historians of Bangladesh routinely refer to the double cloak of colonialism. The official timeline of the nation nods to 1905 and moves directly to 1950, the inauguration of the language movement as a foundational moment. Here, partition's twin is not independence, but East Pakistan. And I think there is the rub, the problem, if you will. East Pakistan, the land of eternal Eid, in the historian Ahmed Kamal's memorable phrasing. Much of the ambivalence around nationhood and identity in Bangladesh, I suggest, can be traced to ambiguities in the meaning of Pakistan for Bengal's Muslims, actually for Bengal's peasantry, when it was created and after the war in 1971, which disrupted, displaced, and reconstituted both older meanings of partition and therefore of what Pakistan meant. And of course, here it's really important to notice that 47 in, East Pakistan also inaugurated a real, as many people have noted, a reclassing or a reorganization of property relations. And this reclassing took place through the redistribution of property along lines of religion, which is perhaps another reason to forget 1947. Thus, the memory of East Pakistan occupies an uncomfortable space, one that must be disappeared. And here is where I would say the irresolution of the Muslim question, so the question of what national culture looks like, haunts the national project. And it's here that I think it's worth recalling Irfan Ahmed's provocative proposition that partition was not a solution to, but an escape from the Muslim question. If the creation of Pakistan cast out, at least within India, and he is talking about India here, and amplified the question, the emergence of Bangladesh provided only temporary reprieve. The wilt for getting this entails means that no version of the national story can accommodate, for instance, the Bengali-speaking, and here this is both Muslim and Nomoshudro peasantry's enthusiasm for Pakistan, as documented by Taj Hashmi, Ahmed Kamal, and many others. Nor can it absorb more complicated interpretations of the so-called double cloak of colonialism. So some Bangladeshis actually refer to 47 as the first independence, meaning this is when Bengal subaltern classes, both Muslim and non-Muslim, had to first separate from upper caste Hindu domination before they could be truly independent. And Gautam Ghosh has written about this. And it's also important to remember the way in which the two-nation theory, and actually even liberal versions of partition work, there is this idea of Bengal being split between Hindus and Muslims as preconceived categories, and I think Bangladeshi historiography has inherited that, but of course there is the Hindu, and the question of caste and class gets constantly glossed over, even in these attempts to reproduce the secular. Here, nationalist desire for narrative permanence and fixity of territory and identity invariably comes into tension with the contingencies and complexities of border making and identity in practice. So by extension, the Bengali is conceptually pitted against the Muslim, thereby reproducing a standard explanation for partition. I suggest that in moments of crisis, the ghost of other submerged histories escape through the cracks in the story of Bangladeshi secular nationalism. Whether it is of Bengali-speaking peasantry who turned to the census operations to be classified as Nomoshudra, or non-Bengali urban proletariat displaced by the 1946 Bihar riots, all of their presences continue to shape community and nation-making practices, and they need to be accommodated, and their need for accommodation brings out these cracks in history. So I would suggest, I'm going to be done with this section soon, that reading the history of 1971 without taking into account 1947 does not simply produce incomplete histories. Such a move obscures the historically constitutive processes through which categories of the Bengali secular national self and other are produced and normalized, and the dynamics that allow for the privileging of some narrative accounts and simultaneous displacement of others. Here, I'm going to actually just take a few minutes to talk about the Constituent Assembly debates of 1972, where I suggest the Muslim question was very comfortably subsumed in the need to forge a national secular Bengali community. My reading of the debate suggests that there was no overt contradiction between being Muslim and being secular as the debates continued. And as I say, there was being Muslim the Muslim way, being Bengali the Muslim way, or being Muslim the Bengali way, neither unsettled the nationalist project. And could I have the poster, please, Professor Salim? This is a good time to show this. Thank you. So what I want to show, I've done, all right, this is really an iconic poster that came out in 1971. I'm assuming, everybody can read Bangla. Banglar Hindu, Banglar Christian, Banglar Bodho, Banglar Musulman, Amra Shobai Bangali. Of course, this is an iconic secular kind of appeal, right? Attempt to forge a political community. And the Liberation War Museum has reprinted this poster overtly. Just want to keep this in line because it's actually, there is a whole, if you think about Bangladeshi secular nationalism, while the poster is about a kind of secularism, there's a whole other politics of exclusion going on that you don't, that's not necessarily apparent. But the first thing I want to say is that when, during 1972, there seemed to be, at this time, no problem with Islam as such being a part of the nation. And it's very interesting to see how, if in 72, that was accommodated, by the 80s and 1990s, this opposition between being Bengali and being Islam reemerges. And I'm just going to read you one slightly longish quote from somebody named Sheikh Abdur Rahim, who was arguably, this is on the Constituent Assembly debates of 1972. He says, "My language and yours is Bengali. I recall with pride Shurja Sen, Titumir, Haji Shariatullah, those who have created our nation's history. I say out loud, I'm Bangali, in my heart and soul Bangali. I was born in Bangla, I practice my religion in Bangla. I will stand in front of the Creator, head held up high, and say, I'm Bangali. I say my munajat in Bangla, and I believe this is accepted in Allah's darbar. The ideal of secularism has come from the soil of our Bangladesh. This didn't come from some heaven. It is the result of our labors," and he goes on. A Muslim nation and an Islamic nation is not the same thing. And this is when there was clearly a debate about the kind of dispensation of the nation. But Rahman powerfully captured the experiential contradictions and aspirations of those who were both Bengali speakers and Muslim in East Pakistan. In mapping the imbrications of his faith and his Bengali selfhood, Rahman refused the imputed religious impurity of the Bangla language and Bengali culture, and refused the other sort of the Bhadralok opposition between Bengali and Muslim that actually is very much there, still in Bengal in many counters. What is interesting is, while there is no antagonism toward Islam, there's also no cartographic anxiety that you see later. So Bangla Share Shat Koti Manush, there was no overlap with West Bengal, and no fear of that. What really, where problems arose was in relation to what I call forgetting inconvenient others. So the point of convention was with the one non-Bengali speaking, non-Muslim person there, who was M.N. Larma, who was trying to speak on behalf of these, people in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And it's really extraordinary to see how what you see in this poster, Amra Shobai Bangali, was really foregrounded, even as the ethnic minorities in the secular dispensation became the constitutive outsiders of Bangladesh's secular modernity. And it's really, the only other person who seemed to support Larma was Shranjit Sengupta, who was the only communist member of Parliament at that time. I'll stop this section with one thing because I have an Indian audience. This is during research for this paper, I interviewed literary scholar, unfortunately passed away, Professor Anisuzzaman, who remarked, without my bringing up the subject, the Bangladesh Constitution was not modeled on the Indian one. The latter incorporated secularism much later in 1979. We didn't include secularism because of gratitude to India, in the same way we didn't incorporate socialism out of gratitude to the Soviet Union. In fact, the Awami League discussions on the Pakistan Constituent Assembly debates of 1955 made clear demands that tea, jute, and in the insurance industry should be nationalized. So you can tell already that during the making of this, already India is a shadow force that must be contended with. Okay. We can leave the poster on, actually. So the next section is called Ekattur's Ghost and the Jujuburi of Fundamentalism. And here, I think Noinika Mukherjee is still hopefully in the audience. I've drawn a lot on Noinika's work here, as well as Bina da Costa's and several other people. So you'll see it. I may not always give the acknowledgement immediately. Noinika, you'll know where you are, but Noinika, in her book on 1971 on the sexual violence on the Birangona and the wound, the specter of the Birangona, also talks about the way in which 1947 is not just erase, the contrast between the erasure of 47 and the hyper-memorialization of 71 in the public sphere, and that opposition is very interesting to think with. So since at least the 1990s, Bangladesh has seen a dramatic and highly visible reconfiguration of public culture in relation to the practice and performance of religiosity. Islamic reading and discussion groups, in slums as well as in elite residential areas, Islamic television channels, print and electronic media, and Islamic NGOs prominently inhabit the cultural and political landscape. Qawmi, or so-called Qawmi madrasas, or private madrasas, jostle for space and significance in densely populated and often impoverished rural and urban areas. Across the class spectrum and the urban-rural divide, more and more women practice some form of covering, which has become a huge source of anxiety. There is certainly a marked interest in how to be a better Muslim. These changes tend to be narrated as the local version of the global story of a resurgence of Islam. Oh, okay, thank you. Resurgence, however, is a somewhat misleading term, implying as it does revival, rebirth, reappearance, or a comeback. The cultural and social practices in question, I would say, are firmly rooted in the present, because the narrative of resurgence is always about, in this linear, homogeneous, secular time, that very much is about, that naturalizes this idea that there was tradition and now we are going to become modern, right? So these cultural and social practices are firmly rooted in the present, in the material conditions generated by neoliberal forms of capitalism, corresponding transnational flows, militarization, and of course, geopolitics. Bangladeshi women, for instance, have not gone back to wearing face veils or designer headscarves imported from the Gulf. These practices mark a break with the past, not a renewal, even though subsequent contestations are played out over older fault lines and fractures. The return or going back implied by resurgence relies and reproduces a progress narrative of secular modernity, in which individuals and societies are expected to leave behind the public practice of religiosity in order to become modern, secular, and fully political subjects. Now, Bangladesh, for many observers, this newly Islamized landscape has produced an apparent paradox of Bangladesh becoming more Islamic and also more modern simultaneously. And the marks of modernity are the much talked about social indicators, more women in the, more women going to work, the lowering of maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, more women going to schools than men, than boys, more girls going to school than boys. So all of these traditional, standard, conventional indicators, right? Of course, such a paradox only crystallizes within a worldview in which Islam and modernity are assumed to be incommensurable, and localized, historically specific trajectory of secularization is recoded as universal. So what happens? Actually, inside Bangladesh too, this opposition between Islam and modernity critically inflects nationalist and development discourses. In secular imaginaries, the return of religion signifies the nation's slide back in time to 1971 and a rupture in the linear progress of national and developmental time. Okay, so I've been actually thinking about this now again in relation to garment workers who I've been studying in a slightly different context, but whenever there is, and if I have time, I'll get to this, but whenever there is a moment of this crisis, when the fear of 1971, of returning to the Islam of 1971 arises, somehow you'll see, whether it's the Guardian writing or whether it's a women's rally in Bangladesh, there is a fear that what will happen to the garment workers, okay? So in this background, it's interesting to note that the sexual violence in the 1990s is explicitly and often connected to the violence of 1971. And in Noemika's book, there's a quote that she takes from a newspaper in 1997, when there was a rise in fatwa-related violence. And the quote from a newspaper is, "The present rise of rapes is only a continuation of the violence against women committed in 1971. This is because the fundamentalist forces and those giving fatwas endanger women's liberty of movement and activity. These are the same forces whose war crimes during 1971 were not tried." Now, I've written elsewhere at length about the consequences of analyzing the problem of fatwas through the totalizing probes of fundamentalism. By implying that the problem of stoning, there really wasn't stoning, but these problems happen outside of national secular time, fundamentalism becomes a timeless phenomenon attached to Islam rather than located in the complex conditions of modernity. So you don't have to think about capitalism. You just think about as Islam is out of time. And the story of Nur Jahan, the first victim, who actually was, anyway, I won't go into the story now. The story as it circulates is really actually quite troubling, because the short version of the story is, there's a rise in fundamentalism. The Islamists stoned her to death. It's a little bit more complicated, and this is important to understand, not as a cultural defense of Islam, but in how one deals with these dynamics of power, which are very complex. Now, the anthropologist Manoj Chaudhry, teaches at Jahangirnagar University, has suggested that the 1980s is a crucial period for this change, when left and liberal ideas narrowed, when, he says, vast hatred was generated against the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami, and in particular, and anything Islamic in general. And as he points out, if this kind of hatred, absolved the need for a political explanation. And the very idea of calling all forms of political Islam, Moulabadi erases actual history and contestations. So he has 1980 as one moment in time, the 1990s as another, when there is a Gano Adalat and an attempt by secularists to bring those same people from 1971 into to try to have at least a mock trial of them. And he says that in a sense, this also ended up generating a vocabulary in which fundamentalism becomes the sole opposition of the state. And again, this is not to, undermine the incredible things that happened with the Gano Adalat or the mock People's Forum, but to show how the way in which the ideological work, as I said at the beginning, of just making fundamentalism as sole opposition does for both the state and middle class senses. And this is the time, I haven't done the work on it, but it's really worth thinking about the rise of middle class mobility, the way in which in the 1990s development money and development discourse takes over. So an older kind of more radical vision of change is also muted. Noinika Mukherjee has a slightly different timeline, but both Noinika and Manush Chaudhary refer to the jujuburi of fundamentalism that allows for a slide between the Razakar and the anti-nationalists. The larger point here is, of course, that progressive politics is also shaped by a secular sensibility that also ties into this problem with 1971. Okay, my goodness, my 45 minutes are almost over. How am I going to end? It's been a long time. In the last year, I've been asked to do 8-minute talks and 12-minute talks and 15-minute talks. I haven't quite prepared for a 45-minute talk, and I see my 45 minutes is over. I want to talk about the logic of secular violence and end with that. The logic of secular violence naturalizes, or let me just say, I have a long section on garment workers and the distinctions with the values attached to religious violence and the values attached to state violence, or what I call secular violence. And we've come to a point in where, religious violence is of course marked and understood. And that's the kind of violence. So the source of violence against women is understood in a particular way, but, secular violence, in a sense, absolves the state and Bangladeshi men of anything, of any crimes. Let me see how I can actually end. I do want to say that I'm not saying, my critique is of a very general, dominant nationalist narrative, and there are lots of people like Manush Chaudhary, for instance, and also here, the anthropologist Rehnuma Ahmed echoed, I just was looking through stuff, echoed this something 10 years ago in an op-ed. She says, there is a possibility, one that cannot be ruled out, that we are loath to let go of a deeply nurtured belief that violence is exclusively religious, that it is deeply rooted in Ekattur, right? That we cling to the idea that the violence and shield unleashed by secular forces, despite all the coups, the counter coups, the institutionalized violence committed by civilian governments, repeatedly so, is accidental, it's stray, it's an aberration. And that it is religious violence, particularly of the Islamically oriented variety, which targets women. And this is, I think, this is absolutely a brilliant analysis by a brilliant anthropologist, but these are powerful and very courageous words that show the logic of the framing of violence and the way in which the national drama has unfolded. So, I have this stuff on Bangladeshi garment workers that I will talk about in the question and answer section. I just will end by saying one thing in my concluding thoughts, that I think something more than fear of fundamentalism is at stake in the anxiety generated by Islamism and the new veiling in particular. I think women who willingly take on the veil throw into question settled feminist narratives of what counts as the good life, liberal feminist. And I think I really want to underscore the liberal feminist and this eclipsing of the left into a certain liberal conception of empowerment and gender equality, right? There's a really, there have been younger people who are talking about how is it that if you have a rally, if you call a rally on child marriage, so-called, which is another very complicated idea, you'll have lots and lots of women show up. But if you have a rally on an industrial worker, this is a real case I'm talking about, taking this from an article by Nazneen Shifa. She writes about how is it that our imaginations are disciplined so that we can all rush to a rally to save children from their patriarchal Muslim fathers, or in this case also Hindu fathers, and that's okay, you know, that will generate feminist interest, but feminist interest will not be generated when you have a worker who dies in a, you know, boiler accident, and there'll be 5 people there. And what does it mean for notions of gender equality, and how does class play into that? And I think the acknowledgement, not that different groups of women might have different desires that diverge from the normative modernist liberal script, is an invitation to interrogate ideas of empowerment as they are shaped by neoliberal development frameworks. Okay, not just feminist neoliberal development frameworks. And I think that ultimately is at stake in this. So thank you, I'll stop there. I'm sorry if I've gone on way too long.
Dina, not at all.